Hello, everyone. My name is Napul Troxy. I'm VP of Marketing here at Dun & Bradstreet, and I'm really excited to have everyone here today. Just earlier last week, I was reading a report from McKinsey where they said that the road to recovery is paved with data. As marketers, I know we all understand that sentiment, certainly. Given how the buyer journey has changed, especially over the last several months, as the pace of digital transformation has significantly accelerated. I know we're all interested in understanding how can we engage with buyers in a more relevant way, in a more compelling way, and provide more insights to the buyer, provide more value to those buyers. And so what I'm really excited for today is to introduce our next speaker, Steve Casey from Forrester Research, who will be talking about some of their latest research and some of their work with regards to understanding B2B buying journeys. Steve will talk about some of the trends associated with how buyers are looking to engage with vendors as part of the buying journey. And so with that, I'll kick it off to Steve.
Thanks, Napul. And as you said, this is a subject that's really near and dear to my heart, focused on what I consider the three most important trends as you think about the current moment, right? So how do I accelerate revenue in this environment? And those three trends being, from a MarTech perspective, what's happening with ABM, both as a practice and as an application, set of applications. What's also happening with the enabling AI technologies that are showing up in more and more of the applications you are using. And then, as Napul mentioned, there's this new dynamic of changing buyer expectations that will really reshape what the future of B2B buying looks like. So let's jump in. Let's start. I want to go through each one of these. Let's start with ABM. So certainly our perspective at Forrester is that ABM adoption has clearly passed the tipping point. Maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, there might have been some discussion happening around, is this real? Is it just sort of a passing fad? I'm very confident in being able to say that ABM is here to stay. As you'll see in a minute, I think it's more than here to stay. I think it's the future. Because what the data has shown us, certainly around this point about is it a fad or what does adoption look like, our data has been pretty consistent over the past 3 years. We've seen accelerating adoption. So a pretty consistent signal through all the surveys we've done. This is data from one we did back in 2019, but it also echoes some recent data, more recent data that's being published or soon to be published by our colleagues at SiriusDecision. And what that shows us is that essentially everyone's doing it, right? The number of people who've said, no, I don't have any plans to pursue ABM, or I tried it, it didn't work for me, is near zero. Where we are in terms of adoption, this data of about a year ago showed most people clustered around the year mark. What the SiriusDecision's data shows as of today is that about 20% of folks are at pilot stage, and the other two cohorts break down roughly equally at 40% each for people who've been doing ABM on a serious basis with an ongoing full program for about less than 2 years, and those who've been doing it for more than 2 years. So as I said, it's really, it is here to stay. One of the reasons we have such confidence in being able to say that, and frankly, I think this has also been a factor that's been driving adoption, is that it is producing pretty positive results. I'd say more than pretty positive. You can see the stats here. This again is from a Forrester survey we conducted about 12 months ago. And more than a third of all B2B marketers we surveyed said it's actually delivering the highest ROI of anything they're doing. And then you can see the other stats where we asked them for specific benefits. Nearly 70% said an increase in cross-sell, upsell, and close to 60% said both increases in per account pipeline and per account revenue. So it's these positive early results that I think that have really added fuel to the fire in driving that kind of adoption that gives us the confidence to say we've passed the tipping point. It's not that there aren't challenges, however. As with any new motion, ABM being one that is particularly data-driven, that'll be a consistent theme about what we talk with you today about. And apologies a little bit, this is a little bit of an eye chart, I know, but what I've tried when we've asked marketers, what are your major challenges with creating those personalized experiences at scale that are key to ABM? So generating the data, you know, tapping into the data to generate the insights to create these personalized experiences. What marketers tell us, and 5 of the key challenges here, the ones I've circled in red, really rely or reflect back on this challenge of mining the data to create those personalized experiences, deciding who to target, gathering the insights. That's pretty consistent feedback we've seen throughout. ABM is a data-driven motion, and people have challenges with that. The other thing we've seen is that, and this has been a perspective of ours at Forrester from the beginning, that ABM, while different, is not we knew in the long term it wouldn't be completely separate, right? This is a new approach, it's data-driven, it has an account-centric perspective, but it didn't make sense in the long term from either a technology or a practice standpoint to keep these things separate and walled off. While it certainly made sense in the beginning, and what we saw, we've asked specifically in our surveys, do you have separate budget dollars for ABM? Do you have dedicated ABM teams? And early on, the answers were yes, absolutely. This is sort of a, you know, especially those early pilot deployments. But through this maturation process, we've actually seen, and this is an interesting stat, right? Both, we've seen a decrease in the number of dedicated ABM budget dollars. It's actually gone down significantly. And we've seen a similar shrinkage in the number of people who are focused on ABM alone. But we see this as more of an evidence of convergence than any evidence that somehow people aren't being successful. But you can see from what people said the benefits were from their programs. Again, in that Serious Decisions data that's coming out soon, that actually shows where ABM is more of a line item in the budget. That budget line item, that's part of the overall budget, not a separate lead gen and a separate ABM budget, that line item for ABM is actually increasing significantly. So just to kind of put a bow around this element of our analysis, what do we think about ABM? Why is it important to you as you seek to really accelerate your revenue in today's business environment? Is that ultimately, we believe ABM will go away. It was about 15 months ago, I stood on stage at the Serious Decisions Summit and with a couple of my Serious Decisions colleagues made exactly this prediction. If anything, I think COVID has been an accelerant here, this drive to digitization. But the key element for what we're talking about today, how do you accelerate your revenue? What's the confluence of changing buyer behavior, AI, data, and ABM? It is the connection of all those things. It's the data, the insights, and AI. That's what's required to help us deliver those relevant, highly personalized experiences at scale. That's really the way most companies will go to market. Frankly, most successful companies. You can't go to market successfully unless you're taking this approach. Okay, now I want to shift gears a little bit. Now let's talk about the changes in buying behavior, which is kind of the second element in this recipe for accelerating revenue. Our perspective, and this is a topic I've been covering for several years now in tracking how buyer behavior has changed. And my observation would be that we've reached an inflection point. And what we're seeing in changing buyer behavior is they're adapting to a changing business environment. And you've seen a lot of these trends, right? Certainly we've talked about the impact of a sudden shift to digitization of the buying journey caused by COVID-19. That's absolutely a factor to be considered. But we've had the longer term trends of that kind of growing tsunami of content and information that just washes over buyers. I'm sure you've seen this in your own personal life as well. The role of millennials in the buying process has changed, where maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we spent an awful lot of time thinking about millennials as colleagues. We thought about them as influencers in the buying process. Today, they're growing in their careers to the point where they're becoming decision makers in the process. So how they choose and prefer to interact with you, what their expectations from you have a significant impact on B2B buying. And then the third, and this is another trend I've been following for a while, is the impact of frictionless consumer experiences, really brand forward, emotion forward experiences that we have in our personal lives as consumers are naturally having an impact on how buyers expect to interact with you. So you've probably seen all of these trends in the business environment, and it's easy to think of them as sort of discrete events. And I'm sure you've seen how buyers have adapted, right? They refuse to take your phone calls, answer your emails, buying teams are growing, they're taking longer to make decisions, and they're churning more frequently. And I think what we need to do is resist the urge to see these as separate and discrete events and understand the bigger picture. What is all of this data telling us? And our conclusion is that today's B2B buyers are telling us in these adaptations to a changing buying environment, in these changing behaviors, they're telling us they want to be treated as equal partners in the relationships that they have with your companies. So prior to joining Forrester about 5 years ago, I was a B2B marketer for a few decades, and I always thought my job was more to convince the buyer to buy, to make the most logical, best possible case, highlight my differentiation, and of course, they'd make a logical decision and they'd choose my solution. So it was really about convincing the buyer. But what another implication of this change in buyer expectations is they're expecting us to change our orientation. So we need to think less about how do we convince the buyer and more about how do we help the buyer in that spirit of having an equal partnership. So it's really about helping the buyer buy, or frankly, helping the buyer achieve their business goals. That's really what they're looking for us to do. And that's a significant change. In our research on this topic, we've also uncovered there's 4 related expectations that contribute to this overall expectation of an equal partnership. And we've characterized it in this following ways, that the future of B2B buying, what B2B buyers will expect of you today and in the future, is a relationship that's more open, it's more transparent, it's more connected and collaborative, it's more intuitive and personalized, and it's more immediate. That's where really I think the digitization mostly comes into play. And while all of these are important for the purposes of our discussion today and trying to help you understand how you can take advantage of changes in MarTech, buyer behavior, AI, and data to really accelerate your revenue, I want to focus on this notion of intuitiveness, or you can think of it as personalization. We use the word intuitive because it allows people to kind of get a handle on, and what I advise people to do is think about the best product experiences you've ever had, the really intuitive product experiences. You can navigate through the product, you can take the next step in your journey because you don't need to read the manual. It's logical, it's intuitive. You can get to what you need to do next. You can get closer to your goal without assistance. Your buyers have a similar expectation of all the experiences that you create for them, not just your product experiences. So they expect you to know who they are and what they want at every step in their buying journey, each step through the journey. This is one area where the data shows us we have a considerable way to go to meet this expectation, because certainly when we ask B2B buyers, how would you rate the effectiveness, the value of the content that most B2B providers create for you or deliver to you? I wouldn't say it was very personalized or very intuitive. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And frankly, the trend shows it's headed in the wrong direction. So what we need to do to adapt to this change, this increased expectation for intuitive, personalized experiences that ladder up to that expectation for an equal partnership, this is where you'll marshal your data. You'll do the hard work to really create a shared view of buyer context. Gather all of the data points, all the touch points, all the engagement data that you can to create a holistic view of the buyer so that you can demonstrate to them, you know who they are. You have that deep customer knowledge and understanding, and it's persistent in every experience. No buyer today will tolerate being forced to reintroduce themselves every time they touch someone new in your company. You need to deliver those contextual experiences that are personalized throughout the journey in every channel, not only at the person level, the persona level, not only at the account level, but ultimately even understanding their relationship in a buying group. The way we've attempted to do this previously is with kind of journey crafting, right? Journey mapping, the premise, general premise being, if I thought long and hard enough, if I looked at the data, I could kind of figure out and set up a set of rules, what would be the next best step in the buyer journey. I think probably most of you would agree that based on your own experience that that's pretty tough to do, close to impossible, because buyer journeys aren't linear. It's hard for us with a set of rules to anticipate what the buyer will do next. One of my colleagues, Lori Wisdo, says it's less like a funnel, it's more like a funnel cake. It's just this whirling mess of steps across channels, back and forth, sales, marketing, digital, analog. And it really has pointed out the flaw in that kind of rules-based approach. Because what we need to do to meet the buyer's expectation of these personalized experiences is not lay out a path for them and keep them on the kind of the straight and narrow, right? Because what that prevents us from doing is accommodating kind of a step we didn't anticipate, kind of shown in the cartoon here, where someone steps off a prescribed journey for them, and our gut reaction is, well, can you go back to doing what I wanted you to do? Where, you know, I'm convincing you toward a goal versus helping them on a journey that they're creating. So what we need is more of a dynamic system, one that's capable of learning from and processing all that data that we gather about our customers to create this, as I said, sort of a dynamic, more customer-driven journey. And even the proponents of this kind of rules-based approach, and I don't want to dismiss the significance of journey mapping and campaign journey orchestration as we've done it with rules for the past probably 10 years or so, because that helped us all be better marketers. It's just that we're at a different stage. We're maturing beyond that. And the reason I have this particular quote up is it's actually from the last evaluation we did of the marketing automation platforms, who I would hold up as the vendors who've really been promoting this notion and helping us adopt this approach. Even they have recognized that the key to creating those personalized, contextual, multi-channel experiences at scale is AI. It's just not rules-based. It doesn't scale. I like to use analogies and metaphors to make these points, and I often think about the challenge of creating these journeys and really creating an expectation and delivering the next best step for a buyer in a dynamic fashion. It's kind of like the way you play chess, right? If you're a really good player, you're anticipating 3 or 4 moves ahead. Well, if I do this, the buyer does that. What if they do that? What if they do this? What if they move in this direction? And that's pretty easy at the beginning of the game. There are only so many pieces you can move. And it's also relatively easy at the end of the game, where there's only a few pieces left on the board. It's in the middle of the game that's really a close analog to the buyer journey, where there are lots of different permutations of moves you need to consider that really separate the best players from the sort of run-of-the-mill players. But it's also true that that approach, certainly as a manual, let's say rules-based approach, only scales so far. Even if you're a really good chess player, there aren't many chess players who are capable. There are always those freaks we see who can play multiple games at once very well and keep all that between their ears. But most of us just don't have the capability to do that, which is why, that's why we need AI. We need AI to solve this problem. Take that same approach to analyzing, anticipating buyer behavior, learning from it to help us make the best possible recommendation in that dynamic fashion to create the best possible journey for the buyer and ultimately help them buy, help them achieve their business goals, which can help you accelerate your revenue. So I've written about AI for a few years now, and my observation, it's kind of like that chess game where I talked about the beginning of the game where there's only a few pieces, only a few moves, and end of the game, same thing. AI to date, my observation would be that has been deployed, and whether or not you even think about this consciously, I mean, if you're using programmatic advertising, there's AI and machine learning being used for bid optimization. But again, that's a relatively simple decision to make, doesn't require a ton of data. You may be using sales enablement solutions that are taking a similar approach of really replicating that human process of processing data, sensing data, thinking about it, coming up with a decision, and then causing some action. Sales enablement is at the closer to the buying stage of the journey, is good at making content recommendations for a seller. But again, those are the relatively easy decisions. It's in the middle where the chess pieces are spread across the board, or there's fully 15 people on a buying team and they're operating in different channels. Orchestrating that journey is a much more difficult problem to solve. So the technology is evolving. Our data needs to evolve to feed this engine, but we're getting to a point. Again, I think we're at an inflection point where AI is showing up in more of our MarTech applications in things like ABM platforms, customer data platforms, to help us achieve more of this, create more of this dynamic system that learns from buyer behavior to deliver those personalized experiences at scale. 2 words, or I think I have 2 slides on data, or actually 3. It is the quality of your data that ultimately will determine how quickly you can accelerate that revenue. That will be, because that's really the fuel that feeds that engine, that process, that virtuous cycle of learning, thinking, and acting to generate at scale those personalized journeys for your buyers. This is another area where we have lots of data showing that most B2B marketers, however, just don't have high confidence in the quality of the customer data that they manage. In a recent survey, it's just a little more than 10% said they had that high confidence. Most B2B marketers are in the other camp. They feel like data management is really a weakness in their organization, and frankly, they're not sure what they need to do. ABM has been a catalyst. It's a data-driven motion. It's caused us to think more, I think, more strategically about how we manage our data so that we can get that holistic view of buyers to feed the machine that will make better decisions so that we can create those personalized experiences at scale. But it's a problem that we'll need to solve soon. So final slide, final thought I'll leave you with is your data doesn't need to be perfect, but it probably needs to be better. We need to start down that journey, make some progress from that prior slide where we know we have bad data, we're not sure how to solve it because there have been emerging technologies or advancements in data management technologies that are making this available to more B2B marketers, where perhaps maybe 5, 10 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, but even 3 years ago, I'd say, the kind of build it approach to build out a data lake and custom analytics on top continues to be, that was really the only solution 3 years ago, continues to be an option today. But now we have package applications and features and functions that are showing up in other packaged applications. So we have things like customer data platforms that are purposely built for this solution. And we have ABM platforms that are built with advanced data management capabilities to help us address some of these problems, to make those data improvements so that we can create a more dynamic and personalized journey for the buyer to help them achieve their business goals and ultimately to help you accelerate your revenue. So with that, that's all the content I had. So I think we have time for Q&A. I'll bring back Nipul into the conversation and continue with that.
Thanks, Steve. That was great. Love a lot of the insights that you provided there, especially like the funnel cake example. I think as marketers, we can all acknowledge that the buyer journey, we need to think about it in less linear ways. It certainly is a lot more complicated than that. And so I'm seeing a bunch of questions here. and a couple of these I'll kind of summarize into one here. It really is like, as we're looking to scale our ability to deliver personalization, to deliver these journeys in a more personalized basis. Can you talk a little bit about like what you've seen as best practices or any sort of guidance you can provide there for marketers looking to scale?
Yeah, I have these conversations quite frequently with our practitioner clients, and it's interesting. Often they come to me with a question about technology, and I start with, what are your goals? I try to reorient the conversation to talk about, what are your goals? What are you trying to do? Because the solution depends on, is this primarily a net new motion, right? Are you a young software company looking to grow quickly? Or are you a large global multinational, organization who's primarily mining their install base? Because those are drastically different motions. But in both cases, what I'm really sensing for is focus on the data, right? If you have the luxury of a rich or sizable install base, let's put it that way, I often will advise clients to start with cross-sell upsell motions. Start your ABM programs with a cross-sell upsell expansion motion, because you'll have the best data. You'll have lots of rich, high quality first party data on those customers. And it's a natural point of alignment and coordination with your sales colleagues, right? So maybe it's starting with a set of named accounts and working from there, from a pilot program. In the opposite scenario, if you're relatively small and you don't have that luxury of an install base, I still often will start with, let's fix the data first. Let's talk about, what can you gather? What sort of signals should you be gathering? Build out that ICP, get a best possible sense you can of who's my ideal customer, who would I target and why. And then the goal is to find the signals and find a partner who can deliver the signals that can give you early insight into who's in market today. But I want to make sure that we're clear, right? You're not starting with in market, but you're starting with that filter of who should be my customer before you narrow it down to who's in market. Tough one to do. I know, being a marketer at a relatively small startup, it's difficult sometimes not to just chase every lead equally, but there's some discipline required here. That's actually one of the things we're seeing in the most recent rev of the Serious Decisions journey. There's a fair number of people who talk about that they're doing ABM, but they're not really adopting a lot of these sort of data-driven best practices and kind of putting an ABM veneer on really what's a lead gen program.
Right. Well, so you brought up this notion of, you want to start with your ICP, and within your ICP, find the people who are kind of in market, if you will. Yep. So there's been a lot of buzz around intent data, right? And I'm just kind of wondering, what have you seen as kind of best practices there in terms of companies just looking to get started there? Yep. What are the gotchas, right? Yep. I should be aware of as a B2B marketer when it comes to using this data? Yep. Is this really like the holy grail?
Yes, I've had lots of these questions and conversations as well. Because I'm an analyst, I suppose I'm allowed to do this, right? I'm going to get a little bit pedantic and get on a soapbox. I'll use the term intent, even though I'm not a huge fan of it, because I like to think in terms of behavioral data. Because what you're doing is making an observation about buyer behavior. And then you're drawing an inference from that. You're trying to draw some conclusion. And how most people think of it is, in kind of one of the more popular methodologies or processes, is to make an observation about content consumption. Who's engaged with, which accounts have engaged with some content that on a topic that's relevant for my business. And the inference is, well, they're starting a research journey. They're a buyer, right? And that's reasonable. But I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that they're intending to buy, right? So as true intent. But putting all that aside, the real point is, it's better than nothing. It is an incremental improvement. It is not a silver bullet. This is not going to be simple. Well, if I have intent data, then I'm going to kill it, and I'm, my conversion rates are going to go up 10, 20x, right? You'll see significant improvement, but it is an incremental improvement, and it's one that builds over time. So that's what I try to do, is help people understand what's the purpose of this. And it's really two things. One is for prioritization. Who should I target? Where should I spend my money? Where should I spend on those programs that cost me real dollars, right? Things like programmatic advertising, right? Direct mail. You should only spend where you have a stronger signal that, okay, I have a stronger sense that this account A is more likely, more likely to be a potential buyer than account B. So the other is the other use case in addition to prioritization, is for personalization, right? So if you can learn what buyers are doing from their behavior, then maybe match that with some firmographics. You know what industry they're in. Great, you can personalize at that level. Then if you can gather some topical relevance, you can gather some insight on what they're interested in, then you can make it even more personal. Then ultimately you can see where this is going, right? It's a matter of gathering more signals. That's the other thing. To help people think that, so what we've mostly been talking about is sort of third-party intent data that another provider can give to you about signals they can gather in the market that you're not aware of. You should also think that this is a continuum. Once the buyer reveals who they are, then you're gathering first-party intent data. And it's the stitching together of all these pieces that really gives you that rich picture of who the buyer is, what they're trying to do, what their business goals are, so that every step of the journey, you can create those personalized experiences.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I like the fact that you've kind of broadened it, right? And as marketers, we need to be thinking about it, not just in terms of like these third-party signals,
Yep.
right? But also, there's a wealth of, kind of a treasure trove of insight that we have on our own website, right?
Oh, absolutely.
That we should be mining. We actually, I mean, for those of us on the call, we've got one of our customers, BMC. That's exactly how they think about it. And so I believe their session is coming up next in one of the tracks, where they talk about intent from the perspective of using it for top of funnel to identify whether there's some interest at top of funnel using third-party data, but then to also mine the anonymous visitors on bmc.com to be able to assess what the
and then once the buyers revealed who they are, to me, that's when you start to really get to intent. Right. That I feel much more comfortable talking about the signals you gather once the buyers revealed who they are, and you have that history. Then you can. I feel more confident in saying, okay, I have a much stronger picture of what their real intent is, whether they are buyers or not.
Yeah, awesome. And so I think we have time for one more question here.
Sure.
And again, I think this is a couple of questions coming in. I'll just kind of synthesize this. I'm definitely. This is on a lot of our minds, particularly in these days as marketing budgets are under increasing scrutiny. We're looking to, even if our budgets aren't cut, people are expecting more out of their budgets, right? Yep. And so I'm just wondering if there's any insight or research or any sort of best practices that you've observed in terms of where marketing should really be focusing these days. In order to make sure that they're optimizing kind of their engagement with the buyer journey.
It's interesting because just earlier this morning, I had a call with a practitioner client who posed a very similar question. Their budget was being cut by 30%, and they wanted to talk about, where in the stack, what should they focus on, what potential programs should they think about either stopping or scaling back significantly. And the advice I gave them is one I would give to every client in a similar situation, is focus on the data, focus on the insights, because that's what you can scale. What you do in terms of engagement, you can choose which channels, you can choose which tools, but if you don't have the data, if you don't have the insights, you can't make progress. You can't accelerate your revenue, right? So that to me is the scalable element. You nail that first, but that is the last thing I'd advise cutting. I would make choices instead about maybe it's some element of my engagement strategy. Maybe I don't add a new tool for engagement, but instead I use, some of the engagement channels I already have in the stack. I think of new ways to leverage those and make them more personalized and compelling based on better insights. So, and I think that would serve any company very well, because those are the kinds of investments. If you make those investments today, if you maintain your focus on the quality of the data and the insights you can generate, you'll be very well positioned for when eventually markets do turn up and we're, I don't know what the new normal is going to look like, but when we're 2 years from now, we're in a different situation and budgets are growing again, hopefully, that you'll be very well positioned, as opposed to maybe over rotating on one particular engagement channel, investing in that and not keeping up the investment in the insights. I think you could find yourself in some trouble kind of restarting the engine 2 years from now.
Yeah, it's almost like you want to continue to make that foundational investment in terms of the data and the insights, and then try out and see which engagement channels are working and which aren't, right?
Yep.
That might be like a way to kind of call out, okay, if it's working, then double down on it. If it's not, then, cut it entirely or de-invest in that appropriately.
Yep, I think that's a good approach.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for speaking here, Steve. I definitely found your presentation very enlightening. And to everyone else, thank you for attending. We've got a great set of sessions coming up right after this, the least of which we've got SolarWinds, BMC, Just Media, True Influence, kind of a menu of options for you guys to choose from coming up next. And so with that, just want to bid everybody a good day, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.